Greetings, everyone. This is Caroline Staten with Transition US, and thank you so much for joining our teleseminar today. And Transition US is the national hub of the international Transition Towns movement that's now in 43 countries. And in the US, we have, probably close to 200 different towns and cities that are in different stages of implementing the transition process and model. And there's a lot of information about that on our website. So please feel free to visit that at transitionus.org or give us a call sometime if you'd like. And we're happy to talk in more depth about transition. So without further ado, I'm going to go now to our guest today, Giles Hutchins, and talk a bit about his work and his book, The Nature of Business, and a bit of his background. So first, his book is focused on nature and what nature has already shown us in terms of solving many human problems, from deciphering simple engineering puzzles to unlocking the mysteries of flight. And in his book, Giles makes a compelling case for applying the same principles of biomimicry to the development of a new business paradigm. He demonstrates how behaviors and organizations found in nature can be applied to help our organizations flourish in chaotic and uncertain times. He presents the challenges to the prevailing business-as-usual model, explaining the pressing need for transformational change, and he reveals the concepts and mindsets necessary to inspire the business of tomorrow. So I'm really excited to have Giles with us today. And a bit about him and his background. He fuses a business background with a love of nature by building a bridge between the two to help organizations transform towards sustainable businesses. He is a business change agent with over 15 years of business and IT transformation experience. His passion is exploring ways of applying nature's inspiration to sustainable business transformation, and his work draws on a range of theories and practices. As I mentioned, biomimicry, also cradle-to-cradle, and industrial ecology, and applying those to the challenges that business face, providing practical insights and guidance so that we can redesign for resilience in these volatile times. And Giles has been working with a multitude of for-profit businesses and a number of leading nonprofit organizations. He's worked with the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, Earthwatch, Schumacher College, the World Wild Fund for Nature, and regularly presents at leading business schools and universities and conferences. He has a Master of Science, and oh my gosh, I don't know what those other acronyms are, so maybe you'll help tell us what those are, Giles. Don't think we have those in this country. And Giles lives in England. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Giles, and thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you, Caroline. And good morning to you all. It's evening here, or coming into evening here in the UK. Pleasure to be here with you. I will take you through the pack that we have, but I'm also conscious of the fact that some of you may not have the pack in front of you or on your screens, so I will talk through it, but I'll also slightly prompt where we are in the pack for those that do have it. So, glad to be here. I'm going to start off, if I may, with a bold prediction. I predict that at least half of the organizations in the US, for that matter in Canada or in Europe, that we know, perhaps love or work at today will not be here by the end of this decade. At least 50% of all organizations today will be dead or bought out by 2020. I suspect most of you are pretty informed, being on this call in the first instance, of the plethora of social, environmental, and economic problems in our midst. So I won't bore you by going through those. Suffice to say, I list some on the second slide there. The Wall Street Journal refers to this age as the age of fear. The Harvard Business Review refers to it as the decade of hell. Rather depressing, both of those, fear and hell. I hope to be explaining to you, uncovering today, how actually these next few years, this perfect storm we're in, actually creates immense opportunities for us. And it's a very challenging yet opportune, interesting time for us to be involved. So as I say on the next slide, we have two options in business. We can either adapt or we can die. Make no doubt about it, business as usual will not work. The current prevailing business paradigm, for all intents and purposes, is no longer fit for purpose. We are at the terminal stage of this business paradigm. Professor Michael Porter, who contributed significantly to the models that we use still today in corporate strategy and capitalism, stood up recently whilst presenting to a number of leading businesses in New York. He said, the old models of corporate strategy and capitalism are dead. He said, we are witnessing a paradigm shift. And notice his choice of words here. He said, we're shifting from hurting to helping, where the externalities turn into opportunities. So actually shifting from hurting to helping. The very things that we've been taught at business school or within daily life in business, working with our accountants and so on, the very things we've been taught to keep off our balance sheets, the externalities, are the very things that will actually give us the opportunities to adapt and therefore to survive this decade. Interesting times. Now, to illustrate this point around externalities, I'm going to ask you a polling question. So the question is, how much percentage of materials from source go into the final product, are still in the final product at point of sale? So for me to explain that for you, just so you have it clearly, durable products, so tables, shirts, power drills, things that are built to last for at least 3 months, not perishable goods. How much of the materials that goes into that production process as raw materials is still in the product at the time we buy it in the shop? Press 1 for 60%, 2 for 40%, 3 for 25%, and 4 for 10%. So if you think that there's only 10% of the material left, that's 4. If there's 25% of the material, 3. 40%, 4 is 2, and option 1 is 60%. Now, it's worth noting that this is for our most efficient economies. So Germany, Japan, America, all that since the Second World War have been focused on efficiency.
What we have, Giles, is we have 2% saying the 60%. 11% are saying, I believe it was 40%. 26% of the callers are voting for the, I think it was 25%. And 19% of the callers are voting for the 10%.
Okay.
So who wins?
Well, it's not about winning, as you know, Caroline. It's about taking part. 19% that went for 10%. Actually, if we're being totally correct about this, none of those answers are actually right. It's actually less, unfortunately. It's less than 10%. So more than 90% of all materials that we use in our most efficient economies are wasted before we buy the product. And of course, 3 months after the product, that falls dramatically down to about 95, 98%. As we know, a lot of power drills that we buy really don't get used after about sort of 1 or 2 sittings. So how efficient is our economy? And that's the question. When we think about externalities, the things that are excluded out of our economy, why is all of that being excluded? And yet we focus so much on efficiency within business. Clearly, we're either not measuring the right thing or we're not focused on the right externalities. On the next slide, I quote Ray Anderson. He was voted one of the most admired CEOs in the US, former CEO of Interface Carpet Company, a high-polluting, high-octane organization, industrial company. He said, "We have been and still are in the grips of a flawed view of reality, a flawed paradigm, a flawed worldview, and it pervades our culture, putting us on biological collision course with collapse. It is the paradigm that is reflected in our culture's infatuation with stuff and our willful ignorance of nature. So just to summarise, we're on collision course with collapse, quite simply because we have a culture that is infatuated with stuff and has a willful ignorance of nature. And that's from a businessman. Now, on the next slide, I quote The Matrix, a film, which some of you may have seen. Morpheus, on The Matrix, says, "You have to understand, most people are not ready to be unplugged. Many of them are so inured, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it." The paradigm that we're in, that is infatuated with stuff and has a willful ignorance of nature, we are inured by. We are all consumers. We are all part of that paradigm, even though many of us will attempt to do the best we can within those confines. On the next slide, I quote Gregory Bateson. And this is the last of the quotes. He's he covered cybernetics back in the 50s and 60s, but also pulled on anthropology and philosophy. He said, "The creature that wins against its environment destroys itself. Our sense of separation from nature corrupts us. It fuels an arrogance, a hubris, whereupon common sense becomes insanity." And on the next slide, there's a picture, and it says, "We destroy something created by man. When we destroy something created by man, we call it vandalism. But when we destroy something by nature, we call it progress." So fundamentally, this is at the root of the flawed worldview, the flawed paradigm that is shifting from hurting to helping due to its willful ignorance of nature. So the good news is, because I know that can all sound a little bit depressing, and so what does that mean for us, is that many psychologists say that we change for two reasons. Essentially, we're not meant to like change, which is rather silly, seeing as change is pretty much one of the only inevitabilities in life. We should embrace change, but we tend to like the status quo, certainly within our current paradigm. And yet we do change. We change for fundamentally two reasons. One, that we've either learned enough that we want to change, or we're hurting so much, we're feeling so much pain that we have to change. And the silver lining of this perfect storm that we're in is that we're experiencing both. We're experiencing enough information from a social, environmental, and economic perspective to know that we have to change. We must change. The system is breaking. And yet we're also now experiencing enough pain that we have to change, whether that be floods, as you've experienced. Well, you experience a number of natural disasters in North America, but you've also, I'm sure, experiencing social ills, as you have done through the previous downturn, and also clearly economic problems with $85 billion going into quantitative easing every month. That's the reality, unfortunately, of the economic Armageddon we're in. So the next slide, I have a little cartoon to illustrate the challenge that you and I experience in our day-to-day existence. We perhaps know that things are needing to change, but yet business as usual is ever pressing. If we're in an organization of scale, we need to meet the numbers, meet the quarterly returns. If we're in our own entrepreneurial organization, we're challenged. Perhaps we have debt that we need to pay back. And we have to keep the wheels on the road of business as usual turning, whilst thinking about how do we adapt, how do we change our strategy, how do we transform. So the good news is that I talk about in the next slide, and I here illustrate some big brands. Now, I don't illustrate big brands because they're the answer. No, much of the exciting stuff is actually happening in the small to medium-sized organizations. I mention these because many organisations I work with often point and say, well, but who else is changing? And I like to illustrate that these incumbents, as it were, within the paradigm are embracing radical change. One example is Unilever, the largest fast-moving consumer goods company in the world, at the cutting edge of a lot of the transformations that are happening. Paul Polman, their global CEO, who incidentally has read The Nature of Business and fed back on that, which was nice to see. He said recently, when standing up to the stock market, he said, "I will not pander to the short-term wishes of the stock market anymore. I'm going to set about purging the shareholders of Unilever, letting go those only interested in the short-term value of our shares, and attract ones that are interested in the long-term value creation potential of Unilever. It would be easy for me," he said, "to jack up the share price of Unilever and in 2 years go off sailing round the Bahamas. But that is not good for Unilever, and it's not good for our shareholders or our stakeholders. What we need is to radically transform, to alter the course of our business. It's not going to be easy, it's going to require hard work." And he set about talking about halving their environmental footprint whilst making 100% of their products from sustainable agricultural sourcing. Now, they're clearly far from perfect at the moment. They would be the first to admit there's still a massive portion of their business model is associated with toxic production, no doubt about it. And yet, when you speak to the people involved on the ground making these changes happen, they are uncovering some really interesting stuff, making these externalities, these challenges that they have, into opportunities to transform their business. Interface, I mentioned earlier, they're on what they call Mount Sustainability. By 2020, they will have no emissions. And having recently spoken to their new global head of operations, I think they're proud to feel that they will overachieve on that. And now they're thinking about, well, okay, fine, it's okay for us to get to zero emissions, and that's air, water, any liquids, any emissions at all, eradicated from their business. How do we actually start creating net positive value? How do we give more value back to society and the environment? Now we've dealt with reducing our harm, how can we shift to actually helping? Puma, a brand that you probably all know, they went about looking at all of their costs, their externalities, social, environmental, and economic costs. What they found interesting was not the costs themselves, but actually how, from those costs, they could come up with new business initiatives, new ways of creating value for society, for the environment, and therefore helping their business adapt. And finally, Nike. I mean, it's had lots of challenges with child labour in its factories. How does it adapt to those? How does it continually transform? And one of the interesting things it's done is open what it calls a green exchange. You can go on there and come up with innovative, sustainable solutions, and the IP will be owned by the commons, by a community. So everybody will be have a shared interest in these initiatives, and it's trying to come up with disruptive innovations, not just in sports apparel, its core business, but ways in which it can adapt and innovate. So these are just examples. I mean, there's plenty of examples in the book, and there's obviously only so much I can cover today, but I'm just giving you a flavour of how some businesses are starting to try to adapt, radically adapt. Now, on the next slide, I talk about a shift here, and it's a shift that is inspired by nature. And as we will see later on, it's also one that can be in harmony with nature. It's what I talk about in the book is a shift from a firm of the past, one that will not be able to adapt over these challenging times ahead of us, and a firm of the future, a business inspired by nature. So a firm of the past is your traditional, hierarchical, top-down, command and control business. Many qualities that a business person could be proud of. Dependable, predictable, well-organized, effective, tight management, risk-adverse, etc. And yet those qualities on their own are wholly inadequate to deal with the turbulent times ahead of us. We're shifting to is businesses that are far more interdependent, far more interconnected, work within ecosystems of partners where each of their units are locally attuned to the environment, so disseminated and distributed and decentralized. And I talk about different examples in the book, so some small businesses right through to very large conglomerates that are starting to show a shift from a firm of the past to a firm of the future, a business inspired by nature. The next slide, I talk about this shift, this linear dog-eat-dog competitive chain that we refer to in business, supply chains and so on, value chains, where we traditionally try and negotiate down on our suppliers, cut costs, very much focused on economies of scale and reducing the unit cost of production. Whereas we look at how nature works, it works much more on economies of scope, much more on relationships. The relationship is important, how we interconnect with our ecosystem, with each other. And so whilst we traditionally see things in terms of win-lose or win-win or win-neutral relationships, in nature it's far more complex than that. It transcends this sort of very binary approach to relationships, one where you have an interconnected web. And people have talked about this in systems thinking and network thinking, and of course there's new models coming out now about leadership and how that adapts. In the next slide, the shift from a predictable and mechanistic business, perhaps a very patriarchal dominator model, to a new model of collective intelligence, where we see certain swarm theories developing, an emergent and empowering approach where people at the local level out in the field can operate and make decisions locally without going up bureaucratic chains because they are empowered. They share the values of the organization and they know what's right in that situation. And so rather than having a scaffolding as a governance structure, detracting from the building, holding up the building more and more, we actually have, if you like, a piece of nylon holding the necklace together. You don't see the nylon, yet it's there. It's a thin thread that holds the organization together through its values and through its way of behaving. Of course, you still have governance, but you don't need that mechanistic hierarchy, which quite frankly detracts from the adaptivity of the organization. The next slide is a lazy 8, figure of 8 on its side, and it's showing sometimes it also represents infinity. What it represents in nature, or from a mystical perspective, is a continual looping, an ever cycling, but also a tensiveness there. Otherwise, an ever cycling would just be a pure circle. This loops round spatially in a three-dimensional way, and it goes from initial innovation in a business right up through to conserving, down to releasing, and then back up to reorganizing, and then through to innovation again. So traditionally, perhaps at school, we may have been taught that in nature you have bare ground, that goes to scrubland, which then develops into bushes, then into trees, and a mature forest. And that's the linear approach. And in business, we have entrepreneurialism, innovation, small businesses that then grow to be medium-sized, large size, and then stabilize and try and monopolize their position. Same with the product cycle. And what this is saying is that that's fine, but that's only focusing on the front loop. In reality, there is another half of the equation that we're just choosing to ignore. Perhaps because we see it as socially unacceptable, I don't know, but this back loop is fundamental. And that is the dying. That is the releasing. That is old things being released and as reconfiguring, reorganizing, so we can bring emergence and innovation through. This could be an organization wishing to change tack. It could be a business unit changing its approach. It could be certain products being brought to an end whilst other products are being brought through. Or it could be a whole economy needing to go through a collapse and rebuild. Or a system, a social system, or a culture. It also happens at ecosystem levels, at whole epochs of evolution as well. It happens at all layers. it's fractal in that perspective. So on the next slide, we talk about the firm of the future, bringing it back to business. How does this relate to you and I in our business? What is a firm of the future? What are its characteristics? Well, these have been taken from nature's principles based on work, for example, that Fritjof Capra and the Biomimicry Institute and others have done. And it looks at resilience, optimizing, adaptive, systems-based, values-led, and life-supporting. Nature's principles. So resilience, it's the holy grail at the moment within business. How can our business become resilient? How can it adapt to these challenging times, seek out opportunities, and move forward? Well, leveraging a disturbance as an opportunity is really what resilience is. And these businesses that are decentralized, distributed, and diverse will be more able to be resilient in these times. Optimizing. How do we fit our form to function? How do we optimize to the situation at hand? And that's this shift from economies of scale. There's nothing wrong with economies of scale. It's just when they're taken to an extreme or they become overly dominant, they come at the expense of economies of scope, and they reduce our multifunctioning capability. Adaptiveness. Sensing and responding to our local environment. That's what happens in nature, and the more able we are to sense and respond, the more attuned we are to our environment, the more able we are to adapt. So being opportunistic to the landscape and to the resources. Systems-based. So a lot of systems thinking is prevalent now in business, but this is also just as much about systems being. Actually being aware of the interconnections that we have, the synergies around us. And another word is dynergy, which I actually talk about I touch on in the nature of business, which is tensive relationships that actually bring opportunities for growth. So not just nice, comfortable relationships, mutually beneficial ones, but actually tensive relationships. And these synergies and dynergies are what are at the heart of the creative potential of being alive. And in the systems space, in the business environment, we see organisations like Transition Towns here in the UK using approaches of interdependencies, industrial ecology, closing the loop and so on, where waste becomes a resource and an opportunity to create value. And that can be about shifting your business model, really looking in terms of process flows, rather than these linear flows of a customer, a supplier, and a product, and a consumer, actually looking at the interconnections that are involved in that community and how can you create additional value. And then values-led. What are the values that we stand for? Knowing what's important within our business. Suffice to say, meeting the bottom line or meeting numbers for next month, that should be secondary to business. That's what comes as a result of good business. You should be in business for creating value. And we've lost our way recently in that regard. Businesses used to be, artisans used to be about creating value from which they gained value back in terms of the activity of working, but also the profit that they gained. And unfortunately, profit has become the prime mover in lots of organisations, which has devalued the business, has led to a corrupting of its values. And there's nothing wrong with saying that we are profit-making, that shareholder return is number one. That's fine. Still doesn't mean that you can't focus on quality and value. So understanding what the real values are that you set for yourselves, for your team, and also for the community that you work within. And then finally, the bedrock that this firm of the future is built on is life supporting. Back to the comment that Ray Anderson and Gregory Bateson made, and many others, the root cause, the root issue, the ultimate sin, or the original corruption, as it were, of our way of being is our relationship with nature. It's that we are seeing ourselves as divorced, as arrogantly above or in some way disconnected from. And of course, it's a fallacy. We are part of nature, even with our specialities. And so by working with the grain of nature, we realize that we can be net positive. We can create value to society, to the environment, and to the economy. And in fact, that's fundamentally really what business should be about, certainly a firm of the future. And a lot of these big businesses I've been talking about, are grappling with these issues. So we have a Kingfisher Group here in Europe. They have 8 million customers going through their shops every week. and I've been talking with them about how they can become net positive. What does that really mean for their business in the future? So this isn't some sort of nirvana. This is very real in terms of what business people are grappling with today. And the next slide shows a paradigm shift. I've taken it from the Dark Side of the Moon Pink Floyd album to show that really what we're talking about here is quite a different approach to business. It's an opportunity for us in these challenging times to just take a step back, take a pause, reflect, and think about what is it that we really want to do in our business environment through our activities. And that can be immensely liberating as we start really just challenging some of the things that we've taken for granted, which aren't necessarily the right ways to go about things. So on the next slide, I show a pyramid with some levels in it. Places at the bottom, products, processes, people, and purpose. And what I'll quickly do, briefly, I could go into more detail in the book, is just briefly go through some key points here to try and bring this alive. So places, our infrastructure, our buildings. These can be inspired by nature. So I'll take an example. 2 buildings in Zimbabwe, in Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe, very hot country. They have 2 high-rise blocks. Look pretty much the same, except one, they're both mixed use. They both have offices and residential in them. And one, when taking a survey, they said all of the people in one building really liked living in it. And they gained a sense of well-being from being in there and from working in there. They all spoke positively about the environment. The ones in the other building, unfortunately, the vast majority, over 80% of them, said that they didn't enjoy the environment. So there's a massive change in terms of how people experienced it. The good news is that the one where people were experiencing it better also had over 80% less energy costs associated with it. So it's back to that externality again. It was far cheaper, far more efficient and effective, and just better. So why is that? Well, actually, that building was designed, inspired by nature, designed on termite mounds that regulate naturally their temperature. Natural airflows, positioning of lights and air ducts meant that it was a much more natural environment, a much more comfortable place to live. So that's just one example. Another example is a brewery here, makes beer here in the UK, where their distribution centre has been built half underground with a green roof, grass growing on the roof. Naturally cools it. Built with natural hemp, which allows it to breathe a little bit too, and they use far less energy, and also it has the benefit of being a bit of a brand tool. People are interested in it. When the suppliers come along and deliver there, they take pride in it. They want to share, they want to understand the values behind that. Next layer up, products. So traditionally, biomimicry, copying products from nature, this is where it sits. There's many examples, we mentioned before, bullet trains, wingtips from eagles being used to inspire plane wings. There's so many examples of designs of products, and this is where this sits. How can we take inspiration from nature to design products better? But also the way in which we go about producing the products in terms of closed looping, cradle to cradle. How can we look at those waste products as streams, as inputs for others? How much waste do you find in nature? What does it look like? What does it feel like, that waste in nature? Well, of course, any waste that is in nature is the input of another, so it's not really a waste. It becomes a food stream for another part of the ecosystem, and that's where this industrial ecology approach comes from, where you partner up with your suppliers and customers. And it doesn't just have to be in industry, it can be services as well. And so processes, how can we make those information flows, those ways that we work within businesses, more inspired by nature, less wasteful and more interconnected. So another small business in the UK, they set about transforming their company. It was a very sort of open, values-based organization where everybody kind of knew what everybody else was doing. And a consultancy came along and said, well, if you want efficiencies, you need to divide up the teams into marketing, sales, human resources, supplier management, etc. I mean, much better, much more effective, and that's what you must do. So they did it. and it was just before the downturn. They went about doing this quite a big change for the organisation. They realised they could sense, fortunately they were small enough or attuned enough to sense that something was wrong afterwards. It didn't feel right. It felt like people were competing amongst each other. They were in these different departments. They didn't know what each other was doing. They had tried to box up the processes. They had tried to put it in that firm of the past mindset of boxing up, of managing, rather than realizing the interconnectedness they had before, the flows, the sharing, is what made that organization sing. And they had the courage to actually go back and change back to what they were in the middle of the downturn. A massive change for them to go back, and now they're so thankful for it. They're outperforming their market by over 14% compared to all of their other businesses, in part because of their values-led approach. Everybody aware of what everybody else is doing, locally attuned, and sharing and working together. It's a really important approach in business. And finally, people. This talks about people. We just have done. There's traditional approaches of taking inspiration from nature, like geese flying in formations, rotating their leadership, looking at certain models of leadership from nature. But this goes further than that, goes deeper than that, by saying, well, we ourselves, how do we attune to our own human nature? How do we work with our heart? How do we become authentic leaders and participators? If we're shifting from that hierarchical, top-down, patriarchal dominator approach, how should we be in the firm of the future? How do we act and interact? How do we become authentic? And that's really important, and it's where a lot of exciting stuff is happening at the moment. And finally, purpose. Of course, all of this sort of sits within purpose. What is the purpose? Why do we go to work each day? What's it about? Is it just to pay the bills? Gosh, it's a shame if we're spending so much of our life just purely to pay the bills. Or is there a greater sense of purpose? Now, there's a company in Brazil that makes tyres and that mends cars and lorries. And they thought, well, how can we have a sense of purpose here? We feel that we should be creating more value for society, for the economy, for the environment, rather than just tweaking cars that make pollution. So they set about looking at how they could help educate their customers and their suppliers to make their vehicles more sustainable, to last longer, so they wouldn't need to change their tyres so much, so they wouldn't have to be maintained so much. And you would have thought that would be putting them out of business. It's contrary to the firm of the past thinking. And yet, they've grown as a result. They have far more morale, they have far more customer value, customer retention, far greater supplier relationships, all because they've started to come from a sense of purpose. So the next slide shows an arrow, shows a shift from profit to value to shared values to intrinsic values. One where we start off by measuring, monitoring, controlling and reducing, but then we shift to recognizing that we need to start embracing new ways of operating, new ways of producing, new ways of engaging with our customers and suppliers, with our communities. And then we need to shift beyond reaching zero to actually a place where we attain positive, where we unlock our creative potential, we empower ourselves and our partners and our environment to actually attain positive. That's the direction of business. Now, if you go on to LinkedIn or any of these communities, if you have the luxury of the time to do that, you'll find there's so many discussions about what the definition of sustainability is, and we, of course, pontificate and discuss that, and that's fine. It's healthy to have that discussion, and yet we often overlook the fundamental of what sustainability is. Sustainability, real sustainability, is in harmony with nature. Anything short of that, quite frankly, is missing the mark. He who is, this is Confucius, I quote here, from 500 years before Christ. He who is in harmony with nature hits the mark without effort and apprehends the truth without thinking. Now, I'm not suggesting that's something that we just wake up and do tomorrow, hit the mark without effort and apprehend the truth without thinking. No, being in harmony with nature from our current diseased state is a challenge, and yet it's a challenge worth embarking upon, because it realizes our creative potential in the process. It makes the environment that we're working in far more vibrant. It makes us have a greater sense of purpose and meaning, and it helps create value in all senses of the word in our work. So I then summarize by saying a business inspired by nature is one where the purpose, people, processes, products and places are inspired by and in harmony with nature, where business helps the reconnection of ourselves to our authentic human nature and to the world around us, to life itself. This is business as a force for good, business that helps rather than hurts life. And it's a new business paradigm, a shift from this mechanistic approach so prevalent in today's business to one that is based on nature, that is organic, that is ever-changing and vibrant. Okay, so that's me wrapping up. There's a couple of quotes there about the book, but I think it's probably best for us to now over to you, Caroline, and perhaps see if we've got any questions.
Thank you so much, Giles. That was fascinating, and I could see that your work touches on so many different levels. Of course, nature does, and those models are models that we can use in any endeavor. So thank you so much. Very, very rich. And just wanted to mention to people, too, that Giles' book, there's a link to finding out more about the book and how to purchase it from New Society Publishers, our friends, dear friends in Canada. There's a link to that on that same page where you registered. So definitely support your local bookseller and get yourself a copy. So now we have some time for some questions or comments and how you participate in this way, and I hope you do. I hope you bring some rich, get some rich discussion going, and it might be hard to be the first person, but press 1 on your keypad, and that puts your hand up, and we can call on you. So again, if you have any comments, questions, additional resources, anything just to kick us off. We have Lynn Y. Please go ahead.
Hi. I just wondered, thanks so much for the presentation, Giles. I wondered, could you speak a little bit more about economies of scope? I understand what economies of scale are, but I don't quite understand what an economy of scope is.
Okay, thanks for that. So as you say, economies of scale, as we increase that, we increase monopoly or regularity of quantity. So it's the Fordism approach. The more scale we have, the more we normalize an approach, the more standardized it becomes, the more we can reduce the unit cost of production. As we do that, the more interconnections we lose because the more standardization we get. So economies of scope are the interconnections that we gain, the synergies or the dynergies, the benefits that arise from, say, one department, as I used in that example, communicating with another department. One business communicating with its customer and its supplier in a more open way. And so it's the interconnections that come across from working together, as in we find in nature how ecosystems have multiple connections. What we try and do, if you take a nature analogy, is we try and make a monoculture, say, a massive prairie of wheat. And in doing that, we destroy the relationships because it becomes about one. It becomes about quantity. We lose all the qualities or the interconnections. So scope is the opposite of that. Scope would be a permaculture, for instance, where you have a richness, for instance, one species that attracts a slug away from another species, so you don't need to have slug pellets or poisons because nature's doing its job. I hope that makes some sense.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Giles, for that. We have a couple more, and I invite people to join the stack here and put your hands up. Steve Mann, over to you.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I've worked in the technology field all my life for several decades, and things are based, engineering things require a high degree of pretty exact knowledge and specialization. And I wonder how that kind of thing fits into the more network-based type of thing. Oftentimes you have to have some hierarchy of knowledge and people telling other people what to do, not based on power structures, but knowledge structures.
Okay. Yeah, you've raised a couple of points there. One, technology, which I'll come back to in a moment, because I don't think that's the core of your point, but I think that's very interesting. The other is specialization, but also hierarchies as well. I think it's worth bringing out a point here, so thank you for the question, because it brings out a point. Hierarchies. Traditionally, there's the classical approach of what we mean by hierarchy. We look at its Latin origin, which is power structures, the governance structures, the administration structures, which is what I refer to here. But it's also important, and you raise this point, which is that there's the hierarchies in terms of structures throughout nature. And this isn't to try and get rid of hierarchies. I should have made this point earlier on, I think, because it's important that we don't see hierarchies in some way as a problem. It's what is innate within them, i.e. power structures that in some way strip out creativity, that in some way enforce an automation upon something. Now, technology is quite interesting because on one hand, it can free up people. It can enable a network society, clearly, as we can see, through cloud technologies, through the open source, through the all-pervasive handheld, etc. And yet, at the same token, it can mechanize. It can encourage us to become less divorced, more divorced from each other, more focused on perhaps the screen or a process that is devoid of human nature and nature. So it's an interesting challenge, but I see technology as a powerful tool. It's only when the tool becomes some form of dominating master that it becomes a problem. And actually, I spent many years working in a technology company, and they see, I think, a lot of the values of shifting to, of being inspired by nature. I mean, some of the traditional approaches, object orientation, networking, and so on, some of the original designers took inspiration from nature. So there's a lot that you can take at a very granular level, but I do take your point about increased specialization. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's very beneficial to have that. It's when that becomes to an extreme that it means that we become extremely inflexible. So it's just, I would argue that perhaps the way to think about it is to try and find a sweet spot. So a Hewlett-Packard working in an open environment, a bit like the example I gave with Nike and their green exchange over the internet, where people from all the way around the world can collaborate through an open platform. So sort of try and find a balance between the need for specialization, but also the need for open networking.
Thank you.
Thank you, Giles. We have another hand up, and that's Catherine. Please go ahead. Catherine, you might be on mute. We're not hearing you yet, Catherine. So I do invite others to put their hand up. We don't have any other.
Can you hear me now?
There you are. Great.
Okay, great. I have a quick two-part question. It's kind of two sides of the same coin. The first question is, knowing that full transparency is, never the case, but kind of a semi-transparent and not just self-reported type of model, are there any current benchmarking, published benchmarkings or metrics for the firm of the future, from kind of a published standpoint that we could be aware of? And then the second part would be from the consumer side of that view. Are there any places where business to business as well as consumers could go to be able to find those firms of the future where they knew that they were, rewarding companies that were doing good and in alignment with nature when they made their purchases?
I wish.
Me too.
Is a short answer, unfortunately. But let's do both sides of the coin first. Thank you for the question, Catherine. First side of the coin is, this is still relatively, unfortunately, new. And so whilst I work with a variety of different organisations of all shapes and sizes, it's not that well known, unfortunately. We are where we are, even though it's now 2013. But if you go on, I've got a blog called www.thenatureofbusiness.org. So it's www.thenatureofbusiness.org. And if you go on that, I think I put it at the bottom of some of the slides. There was an article I wrote probably around December. You can search into December articles, and I think there's an article in there, or it might be November, around there, where I talk about examples of businesses where there was a survey done. I'm not for sure if it was a Stanford Research Institute or quite a large survey that was done on businesses that were seen as more adaptive, more similar to natural systems, and how they compared over the long run to your pure play, what I would call firm of the past, hierarchical, short-term profit-focused organizations, and how actually these nature-inspired ones, or ones that at least were more like natural organisms, outperformed over the long run on all of the indices, which I thought was very interesting. Someone actually gave me that report. I came across it and then delved into it and found some of the details. So I have written an article on that blog, www.thenatureofbusiness.org. Much, suffice to say, apart from obviously what I've written in the book, which is a variety of different organisations and companies. I work with a number of think tanks who have also looked into this space. So here in Europe, there's one called Tomorrow's Company. I'm not sure about what there is in the US. I've come across Conscious Capitalism before, where they do seem to have organisations that are for-profit organisations that are in some way recognised as being conscious of what they're doing. So that's a network in the US I've come across. And of course, Transition as a network deals with local businesses as well as, community initiatives. But I'm sorry, on the second part of that question, I can't point to bodies in the US where I think, go-to places.
Thank you. Well, we'll hold that good thought, and they'll start cropping up soon, yeah?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
Just on that point, though, there are biomimicry centres of excellence now setting up across a number of the states in the US. Now, traditionally, they focus more at the places and products part of that pyramid that I showed, and yet they also are moving into processes and other parts. And, there's some good work there in the more traditional biomimicry side, and yet they are still open to how does this relate to wider business design. So, I would say they are already starting to perhaps crop up, to sprout up, as it were, across the US.
Fantastic. Thank you for the addition there. Anthony, you're on.
All right, thank you. So I've actually been really interested in this space and been studying it for several years. I'm right now actually developing a model where we look at R and K strategies from ecosystem succession and think about how do you apply this to business to understand what would be successful in the future of business. And something that I've had a really hard time with is actually just finding job roles or thinking kind of where does this kind of understanding of the value of being inspired by nature and drawing on natural principles to understand the future of business success, it doesn't seem like that's widely understood as a functional business skill. So
yeah,
I'm not really sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is definitely part of the problem. You've identified the challenge because you're dealing with firms of the past. They haven't got that wherewithal, that visibility, and it's a challenge. It's that cartoon I put up of being pulled in different directions because you have to change, but you haven't got the wherewithal to actually start changing. And I was talking to a partner. They work on leadership with sort of senior leaders across these businesses this morning, and they were saying that they have this challenge. And they talk to, they're engaging. I mean, I would say traditionally the people you want to be engaging with are the heads of innovation, heads of strategy, heads of operations, and CEOs. If you have the ability to engage at that level, that's what you need to be doing. But this partner I was speaking to this morning, they do, and they work with them on new leadership models, and they're still struggling. All I would say is that it's getting easier. It's easier now than it was 2 years ago, and it's certainly easier now than it was 4 years ago. And actually the downturn, whilst a lot of people would say, yeah, but that's the last thing on our agenda now is thinking about how do we be inspired by nature, has actually helped, because people, more and more people, certainly ones that are able to see slightly wider than the next couple of quarters, are starting to recognize that they need to change, they need to transform, and that transformation is quite different from what they're used to in the past. This R&K strategy stuff that you talk about is very relevant. I'll put you in contact, if you like, with Denise DeLuca, who's based in Seattle, who works with the Biomimicry for Creative Innovation, which is part of the network I'm connected with. Feel free to get in touch.
I'm down in Portland for a week, so we could go have a cup of coffee.
Well, there you go.
Great. So, Anthony, why don't you email Caroline at Transition US, and I'll put you in touch with Giles. We have a few more hands up, and then we're going to do a wrap soon. Marika, you're on next.
Yes, hello. I'm calling from Canada, and this is just in response to the other lady who was asking, how can how can we find out about companies that are going in this direction? And it occurred to me that one place that one could look would be to look at the environmentally responsible mutual funds. There are some investment companies that go out and look for companies that are going in this direction, and then they offer packages and things like that. But the point is that I think they have certain standards required, like in terms of their planning for the future, in order to get on those lists. So it could be just a place to look, just to find out more.
Well, thank you for that tip. And we'll move on to Ellen. Go ahead. Ellen?
Hi. Am I?
Yes, we hear you.
Heard?
Go ahead. We heard you for a moment.
We're quiet.
Hello? Ellen, try again. We did hear you for a moment. There.
I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
I live in Michigan, surrounded by the largest freshwater source in the country, and I believe the second largest in the world. And we're now being faced with the drilling of the tar sands oil coming down into the Great Lakes under the Straits of Mackinac by Enbridge, which is going to be moving us a huge amount of oil. And I don't think they have any intention of changing things. I wondered if you could speak to how we could be able to bring real sustainability into this particular situation.
I have been, I hear you, and it's awful that it's on your doorstep, although there are so many situations going on around the world, and have been throughout my life, and the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing is to try and deal right upstream. Because for me, unless you get inside the mindsets of what's driving this, you're always dealing with the effects, whether that be an oil spill or tar sands or pollution or acid rain or whatever. They're all effects coming from an underlying cause, which is our inherent dis-ease, our corrupted relationship with nature, which is deeply rooted in our Western paradigm, in our philosophy, in our science, in our culture. So there's not much I can help with, apart from empathize with the situation and say that the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing is because of that situation and many more like it. You know, it's ludicrous. It's insane. And yet it continues. It continues at a faster rate now than when I was 10, when I first started thinking about these matters. It's I'm not sure if I can say anything to help.
I can appreciate that.
Well, maybe you could spread the word and encourage people from around the world to sign petitions and let.
Yeah, well, we have. We've got petitions here about tar sands, actually. Funnily enough, my mother-in-law has got very excited about the whole thing. So, you know, she's formed a group in her local community, which is also a transition town community, about it, and shale gas and other things. So, yeah, I mean, certainly there are people over here very, very active and vocal about it. Yeah, maybe your local transition group could be a window of opportunity.
Well, thank you for those tips, Giles. We're going to move to our final question here from Janice Lynn. Janice, go ahead.
Hello. My question is basically, I'm looking at this through an educational framework. It seems like this model is going to take a lot of education of a variety of kinds of people, and I'm wondering what educational offerings do you think are most needed to shift or to start shifting the business paradigm? I can think of some that I know about, like facilitation, strategizing, working with teams, creativity, and innovation. And but those are kind of the standard compartments to look at. And I would like to have your sense of how to cast those things in a more naturalistic terminology or way of looking at it.
Okay, well, good news is there are bodies already doing this. So you can take inspiration from. One that immediately springs to mind is eco-literacy. So the Center of Eco-Literacy, which Fittroff Capra has set up in Berkeley. So that's a good center, doing some great stuff, all about education, educating people, right language, how to take that language and put it in. There's also, there's another. I mean, certainly if you Google there's one that was inspired by fungi, I seem to remember, but I don't think that was the right name for it. But it's very interesting. It was an American education group again that used fungi as a model for engaging people, but then looked beyond that in terms of nature, ecosystems, in terms of innovation, in terms of creativity, in terms of acting in a business environment, but also from an educational perspective. Those the two that spring to mind. I'm not sure whether Inspired by Fungi will get you that second one or not, but there are models out there, definitely, in the education environment. If you Google and have a look around, certainly I've had people contact me who are quite advanced in their models of thinking about taking inspiration from nature and applying it to education, which is great because it's really important.
Thank you for that. And we did have a hand just pop up from Carol, and I wonder if she's addressing that question too. Carol?
Mycelium is the one about fungi, and they've just started an alternative education program in Asheville. Really, really interesting. And the question for me would be, how do you bring it to scale? Young people who are living these values.
Wonderful.
Excellent. Thank you. I didn't think we'd get the answer to that, but we did. Thank you. Mycelium. Great.
Mycelium, Matthew Abrams.
Fantastic. Thank you. Did you want to say anything else about that, Giles, or shall we wrap up?
No, that's good for me.
Okay.
That's great. That is the one I was thinking of. So thank you for that.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for bringing that to us, Carol. So just final comments, Giles, to leave us with. And I'll just mention a link to your book, The Nature of Business, is on our website on that same page that people registered from, and it's available through New Society Publishers. And you mentioned, of course, your blog, thenatureofbusiness.org, so thank you for that. And yes, any closing comments?
Well, thank you all very much for being such an attentive audience. Great questions. I hope that's provided some stimulus or some background, and I wish you all the best in just getting out there and making change happen. That's all we can do.